Hey, Inside Out. Thank you for joining us today as we start a new series called Because You Asked. Now, I don't know about you, but growing up, when I had hard questions about my faith, I would often come to my leader or my pastor with those questions. And if they didn't know the answer, I felt like I typically got one of those, well, you should just have more faith. I don't think that's a very good answer for a lot of our faith questions because I think that when we ask hard questions about our faith, we're going to have hard answers. And some answers we don't have at all. And so as I grew up, I began to think that it wasn't okay to ask faith questions. Well, in this new series, we're going to ask some hard faith questions, and we want to invite you guys to ask some hard faith questions as well. The question we want to look at today is it okay to ask hard questions about our faith, about God, about Jesus, about the church? That's what we're going to talk about today. No one asked better or harder questions than Jesus. In fact, in the four Gospels, it's recorded that he asked over 307 different questions to his followers. Questions like, why are you so afraid? Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Why do you call me good? Do you really think that your dad could beat up my dad? Okay, that last one was not a question that Jesus asked, but it could have been that somebody just may not have written it down. Maybe the answer of why Jesus asked so many questions can be found in John chapter 6. John 6 takes place by a lake, kind of like where we are today. In John chapter 6, Jesus feeds 5,000 men, plus women and children, with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Now, the next day, when Jesus came back and the crowds gathered, they wanted to see another miracle. They wanted to see Jesus feed them again. But Jesus, knowing that they showed up just to see him do his tricks, changed the topic on them a little bit. Jesus began to teach that if you wanted to follow him, you would have to understand that he is the bread of life. And anyone who eats of that bread will have eternal life. Now, the people began to realize that they didn't really understand what he was saying. In fact, a lot of people began to accuse Jesus of being a cannibal. I don't know about you, but if someone was accusing me of being a cannibal, I probably wouldn't want to be around those people. But Jesus continued just to drill in and ask questions. In fact, as the people began to respond to Jesus, they asked him questions. Here's what we see in John chapter 6, verse 60. On hearing it, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can understand it?" Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you?" A few verses later, in verse 66, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. When Jesus began to ask hard questions, people either began to reject him or reject the questions. So what Jesus does next is he turns to his 12 disciples, his closest friends, his closest followers, his small group, if you will. And he asks them the same question. He says, "Are you going to leave me too?" In verse 67, Jesus pivots and he quits addressing the crowd and he addresses the people that he is closest to. The hard question that Jesus presents them with is, do you want to follow the crowd or are you going to follow me? Now, a lot of times in Jesus' questions that he asks his disciples, Peter is always the first to respond. If you know anything about Peter, Peter often jumps in and puts his foot in his mouth. He often speaks before he thinks. And once again, Jesus poses a question and Peter is the one to respond. Unlike a lot of the other times, Peter actually does a pretty good job this time. Look at what he says next. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God." Jesus asked hard questions to everyone, but none harder than the ones that he asked his closest followers, his disciples, the people that he did life with, the people he did ministry with, the people that he personally grew with. Why? Why do we think Jesus asked them harder questions than everybody else? Perhaps it's because when we're faced with hard questions, we're presented an opportunity, an invitation to either quit or to own our answers. In the story we read today, Peter has the opportunity to quit and walk away, just like many other people did. Or he had the opportunity to own his answer, to actually look at Jesus and say, "I think I know what you're really asking us here." And so when Peter gave his answer, he owned it. He said, "We believe that you are the Holy One of God. You are the Messiah, the one we've been waiting for." And he doubled down and said, "Where else shall we go?" Unlike many other times, Peter nailed the answer this time. He didn't always get it right, but this time he gives the right answer. But Jesus doesn't really care as much about right answers. When Jesus asks a question, he is not fishing for a right answer. When Jesus asks a question, he is reaching out to build a relationship. Today, we use questions in many different ways, but Jesus still uses them to build relationships. And I don't just mean his questions, but your questions too. Consider for a moment that Jesus, the Son of God, the one who came to give his life for yours, wants to strengthen, establish, or even deepen a relationship with you. The questions that Jesus asks you are questions to reach out and build a relationship. And so it's easy to see that when we have questions for him, he sees it the exact same way. I think too often we're scared that our questions are going to be offensive to God or that it shows a lack of faith. I think it's the opposite. I think when we ask questions, God sees it as us owning our faith, as us wrestling with the things that we really want to know. And most of all, God sees it as us reaching out to build a relationship with Him. So today, Jesus is inviting you to own your relationship, to ask the questions that you need to ask. Don't worry as much about finding all the right answers, but instead focus on asking questions that help you grow better as a Christian. That's what this new series in Inside Out is all about. Asking hard questions. So today, what are some hard questions that you have about God, or about faith, or about church, or about following Jesus? Today, I want to invite you, as you join your small group, to come with some hard questions. And if you don't have any, that's okay. Just listen. You're going to have lots of time during this series to figure out some hard questions that you've always wondered about God. You may get answers, but I know for a fact you're going to have an opportunity to build and strengthen your relationships, not only with God, but with your small group, with the people that you get to wrestle with those questions with together. So, join your small group, ask hard questions, jump in, give people answers. You don't have to worry about being right. Just worry about building those relationships. See you next week.